All right, peace, family. We're going to talk about if John Horace, with 200 warriors, ever held U.S. personnel hostage. So this day, the 6th day of March, 1837, was a high point in the life of Fort Dade. The capitulation, which might have taken place among the important documents of the country, was doomed to be forgotten. The nation, like a parent who has consistently lied to a child, was shocked when a child, the Seminole, was discovered in deceit. The younger chief had never intended to fulfill the stipulations agreed to, but used the diplomacy usually attributed only to civilized people to gain their real ends. The enemy had been made to contribute vast quantities of food and provisions, medicine, and what was even more precious was time. For 3 months, the bulk of the Seminole Nation, including the most of the chiefs from Mikonabi down to Osceola, were encamped near Fort Brooks and Millen, recovering their strength and provisions their larder, under no restraint and allowed to come and go as they wished. Then in June, they simply disappeared, melting away as only Seminoles could, back into their beloved woods and swamps, in time to put crops that would in turn carry them to another winter. So we're going, and I'm gonna show different authors' opinion about what happened there because they do have different narratives on what took place on that day. But most of the people who did go to this place, it was kind of like them signing up for benefits. Them boys went there, they cleaned up, and they left. But I want to talk about the event in question as far as who showed up with 200 troops or warriors. Osceola, as I have already proven, was a black revolutionary. But let's go into it in detail. This is from Osceola and the Negro. So Osceola put himself at the head of the opposition to the surrendering of runaway Negroes because in Jesup's order or proclamation, as you go into further details into the document, you'll find out that he was using that to get the black Indians and Seminoles to move west. And when they was coming to these places, then he was saying, we can't provide protection to the basically Negroes you took during the war. And we're going to get into how it took off in the events of that situation. But Osceola put himself at the head of the opposition to surrendering the runaway Negroes. When Coy Hojo announced in council that runaway Negroes should be returned, Osceola, rising in rage, declared that so long as he was within the nation, it would never be done. Osceola was moved by both public and personal consideration. He had never accepted agreement on March 1837 and therefore opposed any action which would deprive the tribe of warriors or workers. So the first time Osceola was involved in chiefs, trying to make a treaty with the U.S. government to move west, he had killed Immaculate. The dude was basically allying with the European colonists to move west. Osceola caught him on the path and killed him on the path. So this is the behavior of Osceola, as we can see. But it says Osceola, moreover, was not a Seminole chief, but a Red Stick Creek from Georgia. He had no hereditary claim to leadership. His band consisted of warriors who were without close ties to the hereditary leadership, who were attracted by his personal qualities of militancy, courage, and intelligence. Negroes, the element most strongly opposed to removal, were with the loosest alliance to the hereditary chief, were naturally most susceptible to Osceola's appeal. His early personal following, especially, therefore, were recruited in good parts from amongst the Negroes, although it included the hot-headed and particularly recalcitrant Miccosukes. So let's look up what this word recalcitrant means. Having a abstinently uncooperative attitude towards authority or discipline. A person who's abstinently uncooperative with an attitude. So this is the Miccosukee. So the reason I'm pointing to Osceola and the Mississippi is so when we get to the 200 warriors, we can see who they were. Yes, John Horace, he was allied with Osceola. But as we go further into this, we will see that John Horace was a sub-chief of Mikonapi. And that's very important to realize that John Horse is a sub-chief of Mikonapi. So this is the event in question. So on June 7th, Jesup reported that the principal chiefs of presumably Nakos Yaholo had informed him on the 1st that in a few days an attempt would be made by a party of Miccosukis to kill or abduct the chief Mikonapi, Jumper, and Cloud, whose camp was about 8 miles from Tampa. So this is when Jesup had the chiefs, try to move west. Mikonapi when Mikonapi took over the tribe after Bolek, he was already an old man. So at this time, he's an extremely old man. When we look at Abraham too, Abraham at this time, he's an old man. In 1870, it was reports that said Abraham was 125 years old. This is close to 1840. So it's not like he's a young man at this time either. He's still an old man. So these people had a different agenda than the young warrior spirit that was still amongst the Seminoles. But on a receipt of this news, he ordered Major Graham, who was stationed with a mounted company and 120 warriors about 4 miles from Mikonapi's camps, to send out spies at night to observe the movement of the Indians. 2 spies were sent into the camp on that night, on the 1st, and again on the night of the 2nd day. But they either disobeyed or failed to report. Jesup held the mounted men at the fort, as well as those at Major Graham's camp, ready to move at the moment's notice. It was not until the morning on the 3rd day that the absent was discovered, when they had already a 12-hour start and pursuit would be useless. From unofficial account, it appears that on the night of the 2nd day, 200 Miccosukis, led by Sam Jones and Osceola, surrounded the camps of the chiefs and forced them to leave. So Mikonapi was reported as having to refuse to go, saying that he had signed a treaty and proposed to abide by it. And see, Mikonapi was the chief of John Horace and the chief of Abraham. They was a part of the Aluchua band of the Seminoles. And Mikonapi, according to sources, he didn't give John Horace his freedom until 1843. John Horace was subservient to Mikonapi. This is a fact. You can't get around it. So for somebody to say, John Horace showed up with 200 troops and held U.S. soldiers hostage, I'm like, that's not even what took place at this situation. I'm like, I don't even know where that came from. The situation was Osceola and Sam Jones, as we're going to get into, kidnapping chiefs who was going to agree to go that direction. So if you want me to believe that John Horace allied with Osceola against his chief, you got to prove it. Because now it's not even about the U.S. soldiers, because that's a whole made-up situation. The people who was being kidnapped was Mikonapi and other chiefs. So now you got to show me when John Horace showed up with the 200 troops that he kidnapped his chief. He was told that if he did not go, his blood would be spilled. So Osceola told Mikonapi, Sam Jones and Osceola tells him if he don't go, basically going to kill him, which he replied saying kill him there and quickly. The abductors ignored his objection and Mikonapi was forced on a horse and carried off, while Jumper, having sold his mount, was forced to walk. These chiefs had been in council with Jesup on the 1st. When Jesup already was aware of the scheme, could have seized them and captured their camp, he desisted from such course as an infraction of the capulation. In his opinion, the affair was an abduction rather than an absconding, a point of view which relieved the loss of hostages of blame. The number of departing was set aside as 700, and afterwards, no more than 130 was said to remain near the fort, Abraham being amongst the latter. So Abraham stayed around the fort. Abraham was using U.S. interpretations. And that's the thing, saying that Abraham and like John Horace and all of these would agree to it. The thing with Abraham and John Horace, when they would be around with these treaties, they would sign it as a witness. They were interpreters, and they would their name as witnesses, not as signatories of the treaty or any agreement. The hopes of the early peace was dashed, and Jesup, in his disappointment, asked to be relieved from his Florida command. On reconsideration of his actions, he withdrew his request. So this is a executive document, the 25th Congress, 3rd session. This is Jesup to Colonel Gasson. He writes at the time, there is no deposition on the part of the greater body of Indians to renew hostility, and they will, I am sure, faithfully fulfill their engagements if the inhabitants of the territory be prudent. But any attempt to seize their Negroes or property would be followed by an instant resort to arms. I have some hope of inducing both Indians and Indian Negroes. So when people say that they didn't want to go back to slavery, not all of the black people were slavery, but they inducing both the Indian and Indian Negro unite in bringing in the Negroes taken from the citizens during the war. So that was the point of Jesup thing. It was just a little sneaky way of them trying to get, them to give up Negroes from the tribe. And even when the Seminoles was going west, they was putting the Seminoles underneath the jurisdiction of the Creek. They wasn't viewing them as like an independent tribe. So when we go to different other sources, this from Seminole tribe, they got their historical timeline up. So let's say on June 2nd, 1837, Osceola and Sam Jones, whose actual name is Abiaka, and Kawakuchi, or Wildcat. Some say he was a nephew of Miko Napi, but there's other sources that say he was a Mikasuki. So they appear at the Seminole encampment near Fort Brooke before dawn. By daybreak, a group of Seminoles who were going to immigrate were persuaded to disappear into the swamp, and they took off with supplies, food, and ammunition. So no interaction really took place between the United States and the Seminoles. The Seminoles showed up, surrounded the camps, and made the chiefs burn out. This is Osceola and Sam Jones, where we can find the most evidence of who was there. So another one, June 2nd, 1837, Osceola, Sam Jones, and Kawakuchi appear at the Seminole encampment near Fort Brooks before dawn. By daybreak, all Seminoles, over 700 who had been waiting to immigrate, disappeared into the Florida swamps with supplies, food, and ammunition. Another cause for the mass exodus may have been the measles outbreaks or white slave traders in the area. General Jesup is humiliated and submits his resignation, but it is rejected. So Major General Jesup, in behalf of the United States, agrees that Seminoles and their allies who come in and immigrate west shall be secure in their lives and property, that their Negroes, their bona fide property, shall accompany them to the west. By their allies, the Seminoles understood that the Negroes living amongst them, and since before the war, are estimated 4/5 of the Seminole Negroes, including Abraham, were runaway slaves. So this is what they wanted us to believe. So if you got 5 black Seminoles, they want you to believe only one of them was a so-called Seminole Negro and the rest of them was runaways. That's why you got to be careful what you get into. It was all a scheme for them to get them. And they wanted to keep them from Florida because it was a rallying point for blacks coming off of plantations to come amongst the blacks that was there in Florida who were fighting against the system of slavery. It wasn't a slave rebellion because not every Seminole was a slave. So black Seminoles, as I said, would only be recognized as witnesses and not signatures on any treaty. So on April 8th, this is Jesup, he entered into a clandestine arrangement with Coy Hojo and other chiefs to surrender the Negroes taken during the war. It was easier, however, to make such an agreement than to carry it out. Some of the captured Negroes, to be sure, had been taken against their will. This is the author's opinion, and he said they were glad to be returned to their masters. I always have to put that because I'm like, bro, that's your opinion. Where you find the information at? But others, when they heard of the new arrangement, banded together for the defense against the white man and Indians. They were supported by more militant Indians like Osceola, who, when he heard Cow Hojo, as I went through earlier, announced in council that the runaways were to be returned, he rose in rage, declaring that so long as he's in the nation, it should never be done. So it says apparently Jesup had not sufficiently considered the legally most of the influential Seminole Negroes was as much as a slave of the white man as they were the recent runaways. So we do get into Florida, people from the Florida plantation areas coming to try to get slaves from the plantation. From this immigration camp, but they just burnt out. Black people came, got their provisions, and they left. And you already had Seminoles around the area in the encampment, so it's not like they was running off with people. How could they run off with people when you got Osceola and Sam Jones right there, who already fought larger forces, as we would get into on Christmas Day? They they fought a larger where John Hart was involved, as we're going to get into. John Hart didn't really run with the Miccosukes until after his prison escape. This is after the death of Osceola, who he used to run with, who would have had Miccosukes in his tribe, but John Hart was a part of the Alachua, which is Miko Napi's band. He wasn't a part of Sam Jones' band, so they probably interacted with each other, but we're going to get into when he linked up with him. So John Hart and his followers understood that to be allowed to live in peace, they must defeat a large force sent against them. That opportunity would come on Christmas Day of 1837. So in June, we had Osceola going to basically kidnap the chiefs who was thinking about going west. They didn't even make it out the door, like Miko Napi and Jumper and Cloud. They got them boys up out of there. So this is December that same year. So the opportunity would come on Christmas Day, 1837, and against a sizable United States force that pursued them south into the vastness of Florida. After escaping from the hell of Fort Marion, John Hart and Wildcat and their bands had linked with the active bands of the Miccosukee Indians, the most militant Seminoles under Apikai or Sam Jones. The most resolute force of Indians and blacks now remaining in Florida fell back steadily into the uncharted interior into taking a stand against the northern shore of the Lake Okeechobee. Here they would make the most tenacious defense against the invaders on their homeland. So as I said, they're not worried about them little Florida planters when they're going up against Zachary Taylor in this situation, who vastly outnumbered them. So you got to be serious about that. So you think even if this is a militia, a couple Florida planters wasn't running up on getting them people. They may have tried, but it just didn't happen. And John Hart didn't go kidnap his chief with the Miccosukes. That just didn't take place either. You have Osceola, you have Sam Jones, and in some situations you have Kawakuchi, who John Hart would actually run with after his prison escape. Because John Hart was captured, Miko Napi was captured, you had Osceola who was captured, you had Wildcat who was captured, and you had Sam Jones who was captured under a flag of truce, and they were taken to Fort Marion, where they end up escaping. Osceola didn't escape. Miko Napi, when he did, his escape was him getting sent out to Indian Territory, where he never regained his power that he had in Florida. When he got to Oklahoma, they put the Seminoles under the Creek Nation. And then in 1843, he frees John Hart. So this is 1837. John Hart only surrenders because he don't have Osceola no more, and he don't have Miko Napi in Florida with him. So he's a sitting duck as far as people trying to re-enslave him. So he agreed to go out west. Then he came back and tried to persuade other people in Florida to go out west. So did John Hart ever show up with 200 soldiers and go against the United States military at a immigration center? No, it never happened. But Osceola did show up with 200 soldiers and Sam Jones and made chiefs get up out of there. This